In this video, I'll discuss Brahms's most perfectly crafted Sublime slow movement, the glorious second movement of his Fourth Symphony. This is, of course, my own personal opinion, but one that I share with numerous historical figures, like for example Elisabeth von Herzogenberg, one of Brahms's many pen pal musical confidants, who wrote to him regarding this movement in a letter, stating, "I should choose this movement for my companion through life and death." I hope by the end of this video to have shown you at least some of the many reasons I and so many others hold this precious musical jewel in such high regard. The movement begins with this introductory, fanfare-like pre-announcement of the first theme, played by the third and fourth horns and joined by the woodwinds in the second bar, before dying away to the pianissimo entrance of the actual first theme in bar 5. I've already mentioned this fanfare in prior videos as one of the many times Brahms answers a melodic gesture immediately with its inversion in the same voice. Remember for later this particular pattern of up once, up twice, down twice. Also notice that the first note we hear is an E, the same pitch that in an actual performance would still be ringing in our ears from the cataclysmic final plagal cadence that ended the first movement. This introduces the hauntingly beautiful, magically orchestrated full theme, with the clarinets playing a slightly simplified legato version, while the first violins articulate the actual rhythm of the theme with plucked notes. Though completely different in character, this opening reminds me, at least with respect to form, of the beginning of Haydn's Opus 74 No. 2 Quartet, that similarly opens a sonata-form movement with a loud introductory pre-announcement of the first theme in unison or octaves, immediately followed by the quiet entry of the now harmonized or accompanied full theme to begin the actual exposition section. Also, while I'm making comparisons, notice the similarity in rhythm and shape between this Brahms theme and the theme from Bach's Goldberg variations. Back to Brahms, note that part of what makes this opening so striking is that the theme itself is in the actual key of the movement, E major, yet the introductory fanfare sounds like a C major melody, with this final long dwindling E acting as a toggle between the two keys. However, even though the fanfare melodically heavily implies C major, outlining the C major triad, it can also be heard as an E Phrygian melody, and this will become very apparent at the end of this movement. Remember from my recent video on Bruckner's Sixth Symphony, all 4 movements of which begin with Phrygian melodies, that an E Phrygian scale has no sharps or flats, just like a C major scale. Now listen to this whole opening again and notice during the E major theme, outlining the E major triad, that notes from the E Phrygian mode still color the accompaniment, and eventually also the theme itself, part of what makes this theme so hauntingly beautiful. This theme also reminds me of the charming march theme from the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony, composed slightly over a decade before Brahms's Fourth, likely due to its similar orchestration of clarinets accompanied by bassoons, the detached notes in both the theme and the timpani ostinato that resemble the pizzicato texture of the Brahms theme, the similar dotted rhythms, and the similarly conspicuous flattened 7th and 6th scale degrees. Back to Brahms, the horns now return to restate the first 2 bars of the theme, but notice that the harmonies have slightly changed this time, now with suspensions, first this gorgeous one from the second horn, then these even more otherworldly ones from the bassoon, in the case of the first bassoon holding over the dissonant Phrygian flattened 6th scale degree. This is interrupted mid-theme by 2 more agitated outbursts of the Phrygian version of the theme, returning from the opening fanfare. Notice that the same tonal duality exists here, but now transposed up a perfect fifth, so it's B major and G major. This slightly tense, brief excursion to these new keys quickly returns to the pianissimo E major theme by means of this ingenious 2-bar transition that repeats these final 3 notes combined with their inversions. Notice that these groupings of 3 create rhythmic confusion, since they imply a different subdivision of the beats. As I've mentioned before, these kinds of hemiola effects are extremely frequent in Brahms's music. The horns and clarinets now play the theme one more time with the pizzicato first violins, but notice these two strangely wonderful moments when the winds abruptly drop out, leaving the plucked strings to finish the phrases alone. Brahms's attention to little details like this is part of what makes this entire symphony a near-perfect creation. This leads to the first of my many favorite parts of this movement, when the violins, now using their bows for the first time, play this gorgeous new variant of the theme. Notice that it's actually a variant of the opening horn fanfare, with the same pattern of up once, up twice, down twice. This is also the first time the theme is played unequivocally in E major, without any of the ambiguous Phrygian notes. After the tentative, subdued opening, this sudden gush of pure E major almost reminds me of a flowering tree blooming for the first time in the spring, and particularly this moment when the violins jump up an octave for the second up gesture makes my heart almost skip a beat every time. The second down gesture is also altered in an ingenious way, with this Lydian-sounding A sharp. Lydian sounding because it resolves back to the tonic E major, though in the very next bar it's recast as a secondary dominant 5 of 5 chord as part of the modulation to the dominant that continues on the next page. Now listen to this amazing moment and the modulation that follows. This moment reminds me of a similar passage in Brahms's Academic Festival Overture, likely because of the similarly dazzling soaring violin melody that also jumps up an octave and is also accompanied by plucked arpeggios in the lower strings. Remember that Brahms himself described this overture as a rollicking potpourri of student drinking songs. Many people know and recognize the three most obvious quotations, but I think fewer people know that the passage we just heard is also a quotation of a fourth drinking song.
Hört, ich sing das Lied der Lieder, hört es meine deutschen Brüder, alles wieder froher Chor.
Returning to the Fourth Symphony, we've finally made it to the second theme of this sonata form movement, and much like he did with the first theme, Brahms now pre-introduces this second theme as a forte, tonally ambiguous wind instrument fanfare, this time answered by the strings. After the pre-introduction we just heard, we now hear the actual complete second theme, one of the most exquisite musical moments ever imagined by a human, played by the cellos in their higher register. Our old friend Elisabeth also specifically praised this theme in her letters to Brahms, writing, "How every cellist will revel in this glorious, long drawn-out song, breathing of summer." This is also the perfect time to resurrect this Berlioz quote I mentioned 5 years ago in my Mahler video. Notice the striking polar transformation of the theme from the forte, agitated staccato fanfare we just heard to the piano espressivo rhythmically augmented, so now half the speed, and completely B major version we now hear. Also pay attention to the stunning dolce accompanimental figures played by the first violins, especially these portions that I'll highlight yellow, and notice that the ongoing cello theme is also accompanied by fragments of itself, another technique Brahms loves to use, as I've pointed out in prior videos. I highlighted these yellow figures to point out that they return in this variation from the finale, answering these figures that somewhat resemble the fanfare version of the green theme we just heard. And the figure also returns on the final page of the finale. Returning to this gorgeous cello theme, I've often wondered whether it was inspired by this similarly simple and glorious theme from Beethoven's Final String Quartet, Opus 135, since the Brahms theme is just an inversion of the Beethoven theme. Perhaps this similarity is even more apparent in my personal favorite moment of this Beethoven movement, when the Sublime theme returns in the cello part, with canonic imitation by the first violin after this anguished C-sharp minor passage. I often wonder whether this Beethoven theme also inspired the similar theme, though with a different meter, that opens the magnificent finale of Mahler's Third Symphony. And finally, while we're talking about this Beethoven theme, let's jump back to the beginning of this Brahms movement and notice this portion of the cello and bass pizzicato accompaniment that I didn't highlight before. It's always hard to tell if these things are intentional, but I'm sure you'll let me know what you think in the comments section. Now back to where we left off. This movement is similar in form to the finale of his first symphony that I discussed in this video last year, since both skip straight to the recapitulation section after the exposition section ends, and then expand a portion of the recapitulation section into a developmental section within the recapitulation. We now hear the transition back to E major to begin the recapitulation section, that in many ways resembles the mini transition we heard before, since it's loosely based on the final fragment of the preceding theme, and often appears with its inversion. Notice that even these figures in the winds also appear with their inversions. Now, at letter D, the recapitulation begins with the pizzicato first theme played by the first violins, but now accompanied by these figures in the winds, continuing from the transition. I'm still highlighting them green, even though at this point they barely resemble anything from the second theme, and begin to resemble instead the first theme they are now accompanying. Maybe I should take this as a sign that I'm overanalyzing, though it's hard to avoid that in this symphony since everything is so meticulously interconnected. Remember from my video on the first movement of his first symphony that I described another instance of this same technique in which material from one section continues into the next, but fading into the background to accompany the new material. Now listen to this transition. Notice how different this opening theme sounds now in the recapitulation, not just because of these new figures, but also because the mysterious Phrygian notes have mostly disappeared, except for this flat 7th scale degree that doesn't even necessarily sound modal, since it can be heard as just part of the 5-7 of 4 chord. The timpani also now make their first appearance in this movement, adding subtle orchestral color with these rolls, though they'll have their big moment very shortly at the dramatic climax of the movement. The build-up to this moment is a developmental expansion of these two agitated outbursts from the exposition section. Brahms now expands and develops these by adding this new 30-second note counterpoint to the original theme. After multiple combinations of these, the new orange figure momentarily drops out at letter E, as the winds and strings alternate with these intense statements of the blue theme. Notice in this final string entry how Brahms uses rhythmic sleight of hand to intensify the music even further, removing two of the expected eighth notes and causing the final wind entry to occur not on the downbeat, but instead 2 eighth notes early. The final bar of this expansion resolves this rhythmic confusion with these final intense chords, preparing us for the fortissimo climactic return of the fanfare version of the second theme, now reinforced by the timpani having their big moment I mentioned earlier. Now listen to this extraordinary section. The climactic moment we just heard reminds me of an analogous passage from his second symphony, also occurring near the end of the second movement, that builds to these same 2 chords that similarly introduce a timpani entrance, though in this case not immediately forte on the downbeat. Back to the Fourth Symphony, in the exposition section there was already a stark contrast between the fanfare version of the green theme and the eventual gorgeous cello version, but now the transformation is even more dramatic, transitioning in this single bar from the full fury we just heard to the divine reprise of the slower version in the following bar. This time, the accompanimental figures have been removed, and the first violins play the theme with an almost chorale-like solemnity, now in the tonic key of E major. The transition we heard in the exposition section, based on this final motif, is now supplanted by a repeat of the theme, now as a third, syncopated and exuberant variant, with these joyful rolled entries from the timpani. It amazes me that in just 3 pages of the score, Brahms can cast the same theme as 3 such extremely contrasting characters. At letter F, it seems like the Sublime second version is returning for the second half of this repeat, but after only 1 bar, the phrase almost effortlessly morphs into the opening blue theme to end the recapitulation and introduce the coda section. We've made it to the remarkable coda section that begins with an eerie moment of stasis that almost seems like a callback to the mysterious pink arch from the first movement, since it uses the same diminished 7th chord, has similar long sustained notes, has a similar quiet rumble from the timpani, and has some at least vaguely arch-like configurations. But I think I'd rather call this moment the mysterious purple haze, over which first the clarinet and then the oboe play these hesitant fragments of the theme that almost seem to be trying to find their way through this fog. After a grand pause, the clarinet seems to have found its way out of the mysterious purple haze, and the music continues on as if nothing had occurred, an effect similar to the one we heard in the first movement when the recapitulation resumes after having been strangely interrupted by the mysterious pink arch. I have much to say about the brilliant remaining final 6 bars of the coda, so I'll play them for you once after some initial comments, add a few final comments, and then finish the video by playing them a second time. The introductory Phrygian fanfare that began the movement now returns to end the movement, played again by the 3rd and 4th horns with the same pattern of up once, up twice, down twice, and with the same eventual doublings from the oboes and flutes, but now accompanied by harmonies that were merely implied at the beginning of the movement. So now we hear that same exotic sound I pointed out in Bruckner's 6th Symphony, resulting from this E Phrygian melody with a G natural being played over an E major chord with G sharps, with additional Phrygian notes coloring both melody and accompaniment. And if you think Brahms is finally resolving the riddle he posed with the ambiguous naked melody that opened the movement, think again, because in the very next bar he harmonizes the same repeating melodic cells with an actual C major chord, amplifying the ambiguity rather than resolving it. This C major chord persists until perhaps the most tonally confusing, mesmerizing bar of the entire movement, that moves from a C major arpeggio with C in the bass to an E major arpeggio with E in the bass to an F major arpeggio with the continuing E pedal point in the bass, finally resolving to the E major chord that ends the movement. Now listen to these amazing final bars. Now some final thoughts. Like many other people, when I listen to absolute music like this, I often experience vivid and sometimes very specific programmatic imagery in my mind, as my longtime subscribers have probably already noticed. I almost always experience those final bars we just heard as simultaneously serene and troubled, and I specifically imagine being on a ship on a turbulent, stormy sea, but with the sun strongly breaking through the clouds, perhaps because of the C major chord breaking through the E major background, or maybe because of these restless triplet arpeggio figures. If this kind of thing also happens to you during any of this movement, feel free to comment below. I also have to mention that this final F major to E major cadence over an E pedal tone sounds a lot like the ending of an Andalusian cadence, common in flamenco music and also in those fanfares they play during bullfights. But it also reminds me of that thrilling final cadence of Stravinsky's Firebird. Now for one final tangent, the technique we just heard of reharmonizing a tonally ambiguous melody in a new key was a favorite of Haydn. For example, the development of the finale of Symphony No. 80 begins with this melody in D minor, but then immediately repeats exactly the same melodic notes, but now with F major accompaniment. I'm talking about this specific phenomenon, notice that earlier in the Brahms movement, the same thing happened during the climactic entrance of the green theme, when the same melodic notes are first harmonized with an E minor chord and then by a C major chord. Like we heard from Brahms in this movement, Haydn also sometimes begins a movement with an ambiguous, unaccompanied melody. Notice how this one from the Opus 64 No. 2 Quartet sounds like it's in D major until the accompaniment gives us context, so we clearly hear it in B minor when it repeats. And if we're talking about tonally confusing openings in general, here's another of my favorite examples from Haydn, the finale of Symphony No. 62 in D major, except there's no D major on the entire first page. Back to Brahms one last time. Listen again to this breathtaking conclusion of his most sublime slow movement.